Ayla's calloused hands scrubbed vigorously at a stubborn stain on the marble floor, her arms aching from the repetitive motion. At just 16 years old, she had already been working as a maid in the Blackwood Manor for 3 long years. The grand estate sprawled across acres of manicured grounds, its opulent rooms a stark contrast to the tiny servants' quarters where Ayla slept each night. She paused her scrubbing to wipe the sweat from her brow, careful not to let Mrs. Pruitt, the stern housekeeper, catch her resting. Ayla's gaze drifted to the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Only 2 more hours until her shift ended. 2 more hours of back-breaking labor before she could collapse into her narrow bed, exhausted but grateful for the meager wages that allowed her to send money home to her ailing mother. The sound of heels clacking on hardwood made Ayla scramble back to work. Lady Imogen Blackwood strode into the foyer, her silk gown rustling as she moved. The lady of the house barely spared a glance for the girl scrubbing at her feet. "You there, girl," Lady Imogen snapped. "Fetch me a glass of champagne. We're celebrating tonight." "Yes, my lady," Ayla murmured, pushing herself to her feet. She kept her eyes lowered as she hurried to the kitchen, returning moments later with a crystal flute of bubbly champagne. Lady Imogen snatched the glass, taking a long sip before addressing Ayla again. "Polish the silver in the dining room. We're hosting an important dinner party this evening and everything must be perfect." "Of course, my lady." Ayla curtsied and turned to go, but Lady Imogen's voice stopped her. "And girl, if I catch you stealing even a morsel of food from the kitchen again, you'll be out on the streets faster than you can blink. Consider this your final warning." Ayla's cheeks burned with shame. She had only taken a single roll, desperate to quell the gnawing hunger in her belly after days of meager portions. "It won't happen again, my lady. I promise." Lady Imogen's lips curled into a cruel smile. "See that it doesn't. Now get to work." As Ayla retreated to the dining room, her mind wandered to her mother. Alara Thorne had once been a respected seamstress, creating beautiful gowns for the wealthy ladies of the city. But a mysterious illness had left her bedridden, unable to work or care for herself. With no other family to turn to, 13-year-old Ayla had been forced to find employment at Blackwood Manor to support them both. She thought of the tiny flat where her mother now resided, tended to by a kindly neighbor when Ayla couldn't be there. The guilt of leaving her mother alone gnawed at her constantly. But what choice did she have? The meager wages she earned as a maid were all that stood between them and complete destitution. As she polished the ornate silver candelabras, Ayla allowed herself a moment of wishful thinking. What would it be like to live in a grand house like this? To wear fine gowns and jewels, to never worry about where her next meal would come from? But such dreams were pointless. This was her lot in life, and no amount of wishing would change it. The dinner party that evening was a lavish affair. Ayla and the other servants scurried about, refilling glasses and clearing plates as the wealthy guests laughed and chatted. She couldn't help but eavesdrop on their conversations, marveling at how carelessly they discussed spending more money on a single meal than she earned in a month. As she bent to retrieve a fallen napkin, Ayla's gaze fell on an unfamiliar face among the guests. An elderly man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard sat at the far end of the table. Unlike the other boisterous guests, he seemed pensive, his gaze roaming the room as if searching for something. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Ayla was startled by the intensity of his stare. There was something in his expression, recognition, shock, that made her breath catch in her throat. But before she could ponder it further, Mrs. Pruitt's sharp voice cut through her reverie. "Ayla, stop gawking and get back to work." Chastened, Ayla hurried back to the kitchen, pushing thoughts of the strange man from her mind. She had more important things to worry about than the whims of the wealthy. Days passed, blending together in an endless cycle of drudgery. Ayla's only respite came on her rare days off when she could visit her mother. Alara's condition had worsened, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by pain and confinement. "My darling girl," Alara whispered, her frail hand clasping Ayla's. "You work too hard. I wish—" "Shh, Mama," Ayla soothed, smoothing her mother's graying hair. "Don't tire yourself. I'm fine, truly. And soon you'll be well again. You'll see. But they both knew it was a lie. The doctor's grim prognosis echoed in Ayla's mind. Without expensive treatments they couldn't afford, Alara's condition would only deteriorate. As Ayla made her way back to the manor that evening, her heart heavy with worry, she noticed a commotion at the front gates. A sleek black car was pulling up the drive, surrounded by a flurry of activity from the household staff. "What's going on?" she asked Thomas, one of the young footmen. He grinned, excitement evident in his voice. "Haven't you heard? Lord Blackwood's long-lost brother has returned. Apparently, he's been traveling the world for decades and has only just learned of his brother's passing. The lawyers are all in a tizzy about the inheritance." Ayla's brow furrowed. She vaguely recalled that Lord Blackwood had died several years ago, leaving his widow Imogen in charge of the estate. But she'd never heard mention of a brother before. As she slipped in through the servants' entrance, Ayla caught a glimpse of the new arrival. It was the elderly man from the dinner party, his weathered face lined with grief and determination. Their eyes met once again, and Ayla felt an inexplicable shiver run down her spine. Little did she know, that moment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would upend her world forever. Over the next few weeks, a palpable tension settled over Blackwood Manor. Lady Imogen's mood, never particularly pleasant, turned positively foul. She snapped at the servants for the slightest infractions, her eyes constantly darting about as if searching for unseen enemies. Ayla did her best to stay out of the lady's way, focusing on her duties and trying to ignore the whispers and speculation that ran rampant among the staff. But it was impossible to avoid the topic entirely, especially when she was assigned to clean the library where Lord Blackwood's brother, introduced as Reginald Blackwood, spent much of his time. She was dusting the bookshelves one afternoon when Reginald entered, startling her. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'll come back later." "No need, my dear," he said, his voice gentle. "Please, continue your work. I won't be but a moment." As Ayla resumed her dusting, she couldn't help but notice Reginald studying her intently. Finally, he spoke again. "What's your name, child?" "Ayla, sir. Ayla Thorne." A flicker of emotion passed across his face, too quick for her to decipher. "Thorne, you say? That's an unusual name. Tell me, Ayla, how long have you worked here?" "3 years, sir." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My mother fell ill, you see, and I needed to find work." Reginald's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult, shouldering such responsibility at your age." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Your mother, what is her name?" "Ayla, sir. Ayla Thorne." This time there was no mistaking the shock that registered on Reginald's face. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but at that moment, Lady Imogen's voice rang out from the hallway. "Reginald, are you in here?" The old man's demeanor changed instantly, his features settling into a mask of polite indifference. "We'll speak again, Ayla," he murmured, before turning to greet his sister-in-law. Ayla slipped out of the library, her mind whirling. What had that been about? And why did she have the distinct feeling that Reginald Blackwood knew more about her than he was letting on? As the days passed, Ayla found herself crossing paths with Reginald more and more frequently. He always had a kind word for her, his eyes twinkling with a secret she couldn't quite grasp. But any attempt at further conversation was invariably interrupted by the arrival of Lady Imogen or one of her sycophantic friends. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the manor grew increasingly tense. Hushed arguments between Reginald and Lady Imogen echoed through the halls, always cutting off abruptly when anyone approached. Lawyers and bankers came and went, their briefcases bulging with documents. Ayla tried to focus on her work, but it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that something momentous was about to happen. And somehow, inexplicably, she sensed that she was at the center of it all. One evening, as Ayla was preparing to leave for the night, Mrs. Pruitt cornered her in the servants' hall. "Girl," she hissed, her bony fingers digging into Ayla's arm. "What have you been telling Mr. Blackwood?" Nothing." Ayla stammered, taken aback by the housekeeper's vehemence. "We've barely spoken." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the way he looks at you. If you know what's good for you, you'll keep your distance. Lady Imogen won't take kindly to a little gutter snipe like you trying to worm your way into the family's good graces." Before Ayla could protest, Mrs. Pruitt stalked away, leaving her trembling and confused. What was going on? Why did everyone seem to think she was somehow involved in the Blackwood's affairs? That night, as Ayla tossed and turned in her narrow bed, a commotion in the hallway jolted her awake. Voices raised in anger, the sound of breaking glass. Curiosity overcoming her better judgment, she crept to her door and eased it open a crack. Lady Imogen stood at the end of the hall, her face contorted with fury as she faced off against Reginald. "You have no right," she shrieked. "This estate is mine. You can't just waltz in here after all these years and take everything." Reginald's voice was low but firm. "I have every right, Imogen. And if you had an ounce of decency, you'd realize that what I'm proposing is the only moral course of action." "Moral?" Lady Imogen spat the word like a curse. "What would you know about morality? You abandoned your family, your responsibilities. You have no claim to anything here." "That's where you're wrong," Reginald replied, his tone sad but resolute. "I have more claim than you could possibly imagine, and I intend to set things right no matter how long it takes." As the argument continued, Ayla eased her door shut, her mind reeling. What did it all mean? And why did she have the nagging feeling that somehow, someway, it all came back to her? The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Ayla went about her duties mechanically, her thoughts consumed by the overheard argument and its possible implications. She longed to confide in someone, but who could she trust? The other servants were all too eager to gossip, and she couldn't risk losing her position. It was during this tumultuous time that Ayla received devastating news. Her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse. The neighbor who cared for Alara sent an urgent message. If Ayla wanted to see her mother one last time, she needed to come immediately. Panic gripped her as she approached Mrs. Pruitt, begging for time off to visit her dying mother. The housekeeper's lips thinned with displeasure. "Absolutely not. We're short-staffed as it is with all the extra work these family disagreements have caused. You'll stay and do your job, girl." Ayla felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She's all I have. I have to see her." Mrs. Pruitt's expression remained unmoved. "If you leave, don't bother coming back. There are plenty of other girls who'd be grateful for your position." Despair warred with determination in Ayla's heart. How could she abandon her mother in her final hours? But without this job, how would she survive? The weight of the impossible choice threatened to crush her. It was at that moment that Reginald Blackwood rounded the corner, taking in the scene before him with sharp eyes. What seems to be the problem here? Before Mrs. Pruitt could speak, Ayla blurted out the situation, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation. To her amazement, Reginald's face softened with compassion. "Of course you must go to your mother," he said gently. "Take as much time as you need. Your position here will be waiting for you when you return." Mrs. Pruitt sputtered in protest, but Reginald silenced her with a look. "I believe I still have some authority in this household, Mrs. Pruitt. See that Ayla's wages are paid in full for the time she's away." As Ayla rushed to gather her things, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and grief, she failed to notice the calculating look that passed between Reginald and Mrs. Pruitt. Had she seen it, she might have wondered what secrets lay behind their enigmatic expressions. The journey to her mother's bedside was a blur of anxiety and sorrow. When Ayla finally arrived at the tiny flat, she found Alara pale and weak, but still clinging to life with characteristic determination. "My darling girl," Alara whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced Ayla's cheek. "I was afraid I wouldn't see you again." Ayla clasped her mother's hand, forcing a smile through her tears. "I'm here, Mama. I'm not going anywhere." For 3 days and nights, Ayla rarely left her mother's side. They talked of happier times, of dreams unfulfilled and hopes for the future. In lucid moments, Ilara's eyes would fill with a strange urgency. "Ayla," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "There's something I must tell you, something I should have told you long ago." But each time she tried to continue, exhaustion would overtake her, leaving Ayla to wonder what secret her mother had been carrying all these years. It was on the fourth day, as dawn broke over the city, that Ilara Thorne drew her final breath. Ayla wept, her heart breaking as she realized she was now truly alone in the world. As she began the grim task of arranging her mother's funeral, Ayla was startled by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Reginald Blackwood standing there, his face etched with sympathy. "My dear child," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Ayla blinked in confusion. "Mr. Blackwood? How did you know where to find me?" He smiled sadly. "There's much we need to discuss, Ayla. But first, let me help you lay your mother to rest with the dignity she deserves." True to his word, Reginald took care of all the funeral arrangements. Ayla was too numb with grief to question his generosity, simply grateful for the support in her darkest hour. It wasn't until after the modest service, as they sat in a quiet cafe, that Reginald finally broached the subject that had been hanging between them. "Ayla," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "what I'm about to tell you will come as a shock, but I beg you to hear me out completely before you react." She nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over her. Reginald took a deep breath. 30 years ago, I fell in love with a beautiful, kind-hearted woman named Coralie. She was a seamstress far below my family's social standing, but I didn't care. We planned to marry, to build a life together. His eyes grew distant with memory. But my brother, Edmund, discovered our relationship. Reginald's voice grew heavy with regret as he continued his tale. Edmund was furious. He threatened to disinherit me, to ruin Coralie's reputation if we didn't end things. I was young and foolish, more concerned with my own comfort than fighting for what really mattered. So I left. Ayla listened intently, her brow furrowed in confusion. What did this have to do with her? "I traveled the world, trying to forget," Reginald went on. "But the guilt ate at me. When I finally worked up the courage to return home, years later, I learned that Coralie had died in childbirth." His eyes met Ayla's, filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. She left behind a daughter named Ayla. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications of his words sank in. Ayla's mouth went dry, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you saying?" Reginald reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. "Ayla, your mother was my daughter, which means you are my granddaughter." For a long moment, Ayla could only stare at him in stunned silence. Then, as the shock began to wear off, a surge of anger rose within her. She yanked her hand away, pushing back from the table. "Number, that's impossible. You're lying." "I know it's hard to believe," Reginald said softly, "but I swear to you, it's the truth. Your mother must have suspected. That's why she sent you to work at Blackwood Manor. She was trying to give you a chance to reclaim your birthright." Ayla shook her head vehemently, tears stinging her eyes. "If what you're saying is true, then where were you all these years? Where were you when my mother was dying, when I was scrubbing floors and going hungry?" Shame colored Reginald's features. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to you, Ayla, if I had known about you and your mother, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. It wasn't until I returned and saw you at the manor that I began to suspect. You look so much like Coralie." The cafe around them faded into a distant buzz as Ayla's mind raced. Could it be true? Was she really the granddaughter of Reginald Blackwood? And if so, what did that mean for her future? As if reading her thoughts, Reginald leaned forward earnestly. "Ayla, I know this is overwhelming, but you must understand. As my granddaughter, you are the rightful heir to the Blackwood fortune. Everything that belongs to me will one day be yours." Ayla's head spun with the implications. Her, the heir to a vast fortune? It seemed impossible, like something out of a fairy tale. But as she looked into Reginald's eyes, she saw only sink torn between disbelief, anger, and a tiny flicker of hope. Ayla made a decision. "I'll come with you," she said slowly. "But not as your granddaughter. Not yet. I need proof of what you're saying, and I need to understand why my mother never told me any of this." Arity and a desperate hope for connection. I need time to process this," she managed to say, her voice shaky. Relief washed over Reginald's face. "That's more than fair. I promise you, Ayla, I will do everything in my power to prove the truth of my words, and together perhaps we can unravel the mystery of your mother's silence." Reginald nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But please, Ayla, don't return to the manor as a servant. Come home with me as my granddaughter. Let me try to make amends for all the years we've lost." As they left the cafe, neither Ayla nor Reginald noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Lady Imogen lowered her opera glasses, her lips curling into a sneer. So, the old fool had found the girl after all. No matter. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let a little gutter snipe steal everything now. Back at Blackwood Manor, Ayla found herself in a surreal situation. No longer a servant, she was installed in a luxurious guest room, provided with fine clothes and anything else she might desire. The other staff members watched her with a mixture of suspicion and envy, whispering behind her back. Reginald wasted no time in gathering proof of his claims. He presented Ayla with old love letters between himself and Coralie, photographs that showed the striking resemblance between Ayla and her grandmother, and finally, the results of a DNA test that confirmed their relation beyond any doubt. As the truth of her heritage sank in, Ayla felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the grandfather who had abandoned her mother, grief for the years of hardship they had endured, and a tentative hope for the future that now stretched out before her. But amidst the upheaval, one question continued to nag at her. Why had her mother never told her the truth? The answer came in the form of a letter discovered among Ilara's belongings. With trembling hands, Ayla unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dearest Ayla, if you are reading this, then I am gone and the time has come for you to know the truth of your heritage. I pray you will forgive me for keeping this secret for so long. You are the granddaughter of Reginald Blackwood, heir to a fortune beyond imagining, but that fortune comes with a heavy price. When I discovered my own parentage, I was young and naive. I thought I could claim my birthright and use it to do good in the world. But the Blackwood family is poison, my darling. They will stop at nothing to protect their wealth and power. When I tried to assert my rights, I was threatened, blackmailed, and finally poisoned with a slow-acting toxin that has been killing me all these years. I hid you away, changed our names to protect you from their cruelty. But I also sent you to work at the manor, hoping that one day when you were strong enough, you might reclaim what is rightfully yours. Be careful, my love. Trust no one completely, not even those who claim to have your best interests at heart. And above all, remember that true wealth lies not in money or possessions, but in the love we share with others. I love you, always and forever. Your mother, Ilara." Ayla's hands shook as she finished reading, tears streaming down her face. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but they revealed a picture far darker than she had imagined. As she sat there, absorbing the shocking revelations, a soft knock at the door startled her. She hastily wiped away her tears, tucking the letter into her pocket. "Come in," she called, her voice only slightly unsteady. The door opened to reveal Lady Imogen, a saccharine smile plastered on her face. "Ayla, dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I thought we might have a little chat, woman to woman. There's so much you need to understand about your new position in this family." Ayla's guard instantly went up, her mother's warnings echoing in her mind. She forced a polite smile. "Of course, Lady Imogen. Please, come in." As the older woman glided into the room, Ayla couldn't shake the feeling that she was a mouse being stalked by a particularly cunning cat. Whatever game Lady Imogen was playing, Ayla knew she would have to be very, very careful if Ayla bit her tongue, reminding herself that she no longer had to meekly accept such treatment. She was a Blackwood now, whether she liked it or not. Ed to survive. The next few weeks passed in a blur of lawyers, financial advisors, and etiquette lessons. Ayla's head spun with the complexity of her new world. Reginald was patient and kind, eager to make up for lost time. But she couldn't forget her mother's warnings. Trust no one completely. Lady Imogen, for her part, maintained a veneer of welcoming warmth that did little to mask the calculation in her eyes. She took every opportunity to remind Ayla of her humble beginnings, cloaking barbed comments in honeyed tones. "Oh, darling," she would trill, eyeing Ayla's table manners critically. "We simply must work on your deportment. We can't have you embarrassing the family at social functions, can we?" As Ayla struggled to find her footing in this new life, tensions within the household continued to escalate. Reginald and Lady Imogen argued constantly, their voices carrying through the manor's halls. The subject of their disputes was always the same: control of the Blackwood fortune. One evening, as Ayla was returning from a walk in the gardens, she overheard a heated exchange between the two. "You can't do this, Reginald," Lady Imogen hissed. "Think of everything I've sacrificed to keep this family's reputation intact. You can't just hand it all over to some gutter snipe." Reginald's voice was cold with anger. "That gutter snipe is my granddaughter and the rightful heir to everything we possess. It's time for you to accept that, Imogen." "Never," Lady Imogen spat. "I'll see this entire family ruined before I let that girl take what's mine." Heart-pounding, Ayla slipped away before she could be discovered. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. The Blackwood family is poison. They will stop at nothing to protect their wealth and power. For the first time, Ayla began to truly understand the danger she was in. This wasn't just about claiming an inheritance, it was about survival. Determined to protect herself, Ayla threw herself into learning everything she could about the Blackwood family history and finances. She pored over old documents, studied the family's business dealings, and began to piece together a picture of decades of corruption and deceit. As she delved deeper into the family's secrets, Ayla made a startling discovery. Hidden away in a dusty corner of the manor's extensive library, she found a series of ledgers detailing years of illegal activities: money laundering, bribery, even darker crimes, all carefully concealed behind a veneer of respectability. Ayla's blood ran cold as she realized the true extent of the Blackwood family's misdeeds. This was why her mother had warned her. This was the poison at the heart of her inheritance. But what could she do with this knowledge? If she exposed the truth, it would mean the ruin of the entire family, including herself. If she kept quiet, she would be complicit in generations of wrongdoing. As Ayla grappled with this moral dilemma, she failed to notice the shadow that fell across the library doorway. Lady Imogen stood there, her eyes glittering with malice as she watched the girl pore over the incriminating documents. So, the little pauper thought she could play detective? Lady Imogen's lips curled into a cruel smile. Well, two could play at that game, and she had years of experience in dealing with threats to her position. Silently, she retreated from the doorway, her mind already formulating a plan. Ayla Thorne might think she had the upper hand, but she was about to learn a harsh lesson about what it truly meant to be a Blackwood. As the days passed, Ayla found herself caught in an increasingly complex web of family politics and long-buried secrets. She tried to confide in Reginald, but found him strangely evasive when she brought up her discoveries. "The past is the past, my dear," he would say, patting her hand dismissively. "What matters now is securing your future as the head of this family." But Ayla couldn't shake the feeling that the past was far from buried. Everywhere she turned, she sensed hidden agendas and unspoken threats. The weight of her newfound wealth and status began to feel less like a fairy tale and more like a gilded cage. One evening, as Ayla sat in her room contemplating her next move, a soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, standing there with an uncharacteristically hesitant expression. "Miss Ayla," she said in a low voice, glancing nervously down the hallway. "There's something you need to see. Something about your mother." Intrigued and wary, Ayla followed Mrs. Pruitt through the winding corridors of the manor, down to a part of the house she had never seen before. They stopped before a heavy oak door, which Mrs. Pruitt unlocked with trembling hands. "I've worked in this house for 40 years, the older woman whispered. "Seen things I wish I could forget. But what they did to your mother, it wasn't right. And I can't keep silent any longer." As the door swung open, Ayla gasped in shock. The room beyond was filled with medical equipment, monitors, IV stands, and at the center, a hospital bed. And in that bed, hooked up to softly beeping machines, lay a frail figure that Ayla recognized with a jolt of disbelief. "Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking. Alara Thorne's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her daughter with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "My darling girl," she breathed. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to see me like this." Ayla rushed to her mother's side, tears streaming down her face. "But how?" "I thought, we buried you." Mrs. Pruitt spoke up from the doorway, her voice heavy with guilt. "It was all a charade, Miss Ayla. Lady Imogen's doing. She's been keeping your mother here, using her illness to manipulate you both." As the full impact of this betrayal washed over her, Ayla felt a cold fury building in her chest. All this time, her mother had been alive, hidden away in this sterile prison. All the grief, all the loneliness she had endured, it had all been based on a cruel lie. In that moment, something shifted inside Ayla. The last vestiges of the naive girl she had been fell away, replaced by a steely determination. She turned to Mrs. Pruitt, her eyes blazing with newfound purpose. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Now I need you to tell me everything you know about what's really been going on in this house." As Mrs. Pruitt began to speak, spilling out years of secrets and lies, Ayla held her mother's hand tightly. She had entered Blackwood Manor as a powerless servant, but she would leave it as something else entirely. The true heir to the Blackwood fortune had awakened, and she would stop at nothing to claim what was rightfully hers, and to bring those who had wronged her family to justice. The game had changed, and Ayla Thorne was ready to play for keeps. In the days that followed, Ayla's world transformed once again. With her mother's fragile but living presence as her anchor, she began to navigate the treacherous waters of Blackwood family politics with a new sense of purpose. She confronted Reginald first, her hurt and anger palpable as she demanded answers. To her surprise, her grandfather broke down, confessing that he had known about Alara's condition, but had been powerless to intervene. "Imogen holds the reins of this family's power," he admitted, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his guilt. "She threatened to expose all of our illegal dealings if I didn't play along with her schemes. I thought I could protect you both by going along with it, by bringing you into the family slowly. I see now how wrong I was." Ayla's heart hardened at his words. She had wanted so badly to believe in the fairy tale of a loving grandfather, but the reality was far more complex and painful. "You had a choice," she said coldly. "You chose your wealth and your reputation over doing what was right, but I won't make the same mistake." With Reginald's reluctant cooperation and Mrs. Pruitt's insider knowledge, Ayla began to build a case against Lady Imogen. She gathered evidence of financial fraud, of the illegal detention of her mother, of years of manipulation and deceit. But Lady Imogen was not about to go down without a fight. As she realized the net was closing in around her, she made one last, desperate play for control. At a lavish party ostensibly thrown to officially welcome Ayla into the family, Lady Imogen struck. As Ayla raised a glass to make a toast, she suddenly felt dizzy, her vision blurring. She barely registered the triumphant gleam in Lady Imogen's eye before everything went black. When Ayla awoke, she found herself in a small, windowless room, her head pounding and her wrists bound. Lady Imogen loomed over her, all pretense of civility gone. "Did you really think you could best me, you little fool?" Lady Imogen hissed. I've spent decades building this empire, and I won't let some upstart girl tear it all down. Ayla struggled against her bonds, her mind racing. She had underestimated Lady Imogen's desperation, and now she was paying the price. But she refused to give up. Too much was at stake. "You can't keep me here forever," Ayla said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "People will notice I'm missing. Reginald, the staff—" Lady Imogen's laugh was cold and brittle. "Oh, my dear, you still don't understand how this world works, do you? Money buys silence, influence quiets questions. By the time anyone thinks to look for you, it'll be far too late." As the older woman turned to leave, Ayla called out, "Why? Why go to all this trouble? The fortune isn't even rightfully yours." Lady Imogen paused at the door, her eyes glittering with a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. "Because it should have been. I gave everything to this family, my youth, my dreams, my very soul. And what did I get in return? A loveless marriage to a weak man who could never measure up to his brother." She stepped closer to Ayla, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Reginald was supposed to be mine. We were betrothed since childhood, but he threw it all away for your grandmother, that common little seamstress. So I took what should have been mine by right, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me now." With that, Lady Imogen swept out of the room, leaving Ayla alone in the darkness. Hours passed, maybe days. Ayla lost track of time in her windowless prison. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind foggy from whatever drug Lady Imogen had used on her. But in her lucid moments, she forced herself to think, to plan. She thought of her mother, finally free from her own prison, waiting for a daughter who might never return. She thought of the years of hardship they had endured, of the injustices perpetrated by the Blackwood family. And slowly, a resolve began to build within her. Ayla had entered this world as a powerless servant, but she had learned, she had watched, she had listened, and she had grown. She was a Blackwood by blood, but she was her mother's daughter by choice. And she would not let Lady Imogen win. Using every ounce of strength she could muster, Ayla began to work at her bonds. The ropes were tight, but she remembered a trick one of the other servants had once shown her, a way to create slack, to slowly work her way free. It was painstaking work, and more than once Ayla felt on the verge of giving up. But each time she forced herself to continue, drawing on a well of determination she hadn't known she possessed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt the ropes give way. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, but she was free. Cautiously, Ayla explored her prison. It was a small room, probably used for storage, with no windows and only one door. She pressed her ear against it, listening intently for any sound of movement outside. Hearing nothing, she steeled herself and tried the handle. To her shock, it turned easily. Either Lady Imogen had grown overconfident, or, more likely, she never imagined Ayla would be able to free herself from her bonds. Heart-pounding, Ayla eased the door open and peered out into a dimly lit hallway. She recognized it as part of the manor's extensive basement, an area she had cleaned many times in her days as a maid. A spark of hope ignited in her chest. She knew these passages, knew the hidden routes and secret doors that honeycombed the old house. Moving as quietly as she could, Ayla made her way through the basement, pausing at every sound. She had no idea how long she had been imprisoned, or what might have transpired in her absence. For all she knew, Lady Imogen could have already succeeded in erasing her existence from the world above. As she neared the stairs that would lead up to the main house, Ayla heard voices. She froze, pressing herself against the wall and hardly daring to breathe. "Can't keep this up forever," came Reginald's voice, strained and weary. "People are asking questions. The girl's mother is frantic." "Let them ask," Lady Imogen snapped. "By the time anyone thinks to look down here, it'll be too late. A tragic accident, that's what they'll say. Poor little Ayla, overwhelmed by her newfound wealth and status, took her own life. So sad, so very sad." Ayla's blood ran cold at the casual way Lady Imogen discussed her planned murder. But underneath the fear, A spark of anger ignited. She had not come this far, endured so much only to be erased from existence by this cruel, grasping woman. Making a split-second decision, Ayla darted across the hallway to a hidden door she remembered from her cleaning days. It led to a narrow passage that wound its way up through the walls of the house, originally built as an escape route in more tumultuous times. As she climbed, ignoring the ache in her muscles and the sting of her raw wrists, Ayla's mind raced. She needed proof, something concrete to expose Lady Imogen's crimes. And she knew just where to find it. Emerging from the hidden passage on the 3rd floor, Ayla made her way silently to Lady Imogen's private study. The room was locked, but again, Ayla's time as a servant proved useful. She knew exactly where the spare key was hidden. Inside the opulent room, Ayla headed straight for the ornate desk. Her hands shook as she rifled through drawers and papers, searching for anything that could incriminate Lady Imogen. And there, in a hidden compartment, she found it. A small black book filled with dates, names, and amounts, a detailed record of years of blackmail, bribery, and worse. As Ayla clutched her prize, a sound at the door made her whirl around. Lady Imogen stood there, her face a mask of fury. "You little bitch," she snarled, advancing into the room. "I should have known you'd be trouble, just like your grandmother always poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Ayla backed away, her heart pounding. She was trapped, with nowhere to run. But as Lady Imogen lunged for her, something inside Ayla snapped. She was done running, done hiding, done being the victim. With a cry of defiance, Ayla dodged Lady Imogen's grasp and bolted for the door. She raced through the halls of Blackwood Manor, the place that had been both her prison and her birthright. Behind her, she could hear Lady Imogen's enraged shouts and the pounding of feet. Ayla ran as she had never run before, clutching the damning ledger to her chest. She burst out of the front doors and into the gathering dusk where a crowd had assembled. Police, reporters, and at the forefront, her mother Alara, pale but standing tall. "Ayla!" Alara cried, rushing forward to embrace her daughter. As the police swarmed around them, as Lady Imogen's shrieks of rage turned to pleas for mercy, as camera flashes popped and reporters shouted questions, Ayla stood rooted to the spot. She looked up at the imposing facade of Blackwood Manor, the house that had dominated her life for so long. In that moment, she made a decision. The Blackwood fortune, with all its dark history and tainted legacy, meant nothing to her. What mattered was the truth, justice, and the love of the mother she had thought lost forever. Ayla turned to the assembled crowd, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "My name is Ayla Thorne," she declared, "and I have a story to tell you." In the days and weeks that followed, the Blackwood Empire crumbled. Lady Imogen and her co-conspirators were arrested, their crimes laid bare for all to see. Reginald, broken by guilt and shame, turned himself in, confessing to years of complicity in the family's illegal activities. Ayla found herself the sole heir to a vast but tainted fortune. But rather than claim it for herself, she made another choice. She established a foundation dedicated to helping exploited workers and supporting education for underprivileged youth. The wealth that had been accumulated through generations of greed and corruption would be used to make amends, to create opportunities for those who had been denied them. As for Ayla herself, she and Alara left Blackwood Manor behind. They moved to a small cottage by the sea, where Alara could regain her strength and Ayla could finally begin to heal from the traumas of her past. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset together, Alara turned to her daughter with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "You faced down demons that would have broken lesser souls. You had every right to claim that fortune for yourself after everything you've been through." Ayla smiled, taking her mother's hand. "The only fortune I need is right here," she said. "You taught me long ago that true wealth isn't about money or power. It's about love, integrity, and doing what's right. That's the real inheritance you gave me. And it's worth more than all the Blackwood millions combined." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of gold and pink, Ayla felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her journey had been long and fraught with danger, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and with her spirit intact. She was no longer the frightened girl who had scrubbed floors and dodged cruel words. She was Ayla Thorne, daughter of Alara, granddaughter of Coralie, a woman who had faced the darkness of greed and corruption and chosen a different path. The tale of the maid who became an heiress would be told for years to come, but for Ayla, the most important story was the one she lived every day. A story of love, redemption, and the enduring power of the human spirit to rise above adversity and choose the light,